Ever find yourself wondering why building software feels like it went from this super structured, almost architectural process to something much more, well, fluid?
Yeah, it's a really common observation.
Today on the deep dive, tailored just for you, we're unpacking that exact evolution in software development.
Exactly. We're diving into the shift from what's known as the waterfall model to agile methodologies. It's quite a story.
Think of it like this. Waterfall is maybe like drafting incredibly detailed blueprints for an entire skyscraper before laying a single brick.
That's a great analogy. And agile, on the other hand, is more like building that skyscraper, maybe floor by floor, getting feedback from the future tenants after each stage.
And adjusting the plans as you go.
Precisely. Adapting.
So to understand this transformation, we've got some really insightful excerpts from a lecture. It's titled Waterfall to Agile.
Mm-hmm.
And it really gets into how this change impacted something fundamental, figuring out exactly what a piece of software needs to do.
Right. The requirements, which ties into core computer science concepts, especially functional requirements. You often hear them called user stories these days, particularly in agile contexts.
So our goal today, our mission for you, is pretty straightforward but crucial.
Yeah, we want to explore why the software world largely moved away from that waterfall approach.
And embraced Agile. We'll
Yeah.
look at the inherent challenges of Waterfall, the things that just weren't working.
And then the key ideas behind Agile that make it so appealing. We want to give you a clear picture, quick but thorough understanding of this pivotal shift without getting totally bogged down in jargon.
Okay, so let's start with Waterfall then. Where did that come from?
Well, the idea really took hold after a paper by Winston Royce back in 1970.
Okay.
And the core concept was this very linear, step-by-step process. Think of an actual waterfall.
Right, cascading down.
Exactly. Each stage flows neatly into the next. First, you define all the requirements, lock them down.
All of them up front.
That was the idea. Then you design the entire system based on those requirements. Then you build it or implement it. Then you test it. And finally, you deploy it, roll it out.
And documentation was key too, wasn't it?
Oh, huge. Meticulous documentation at every stage was a really big part of the whole philosophy.
Okay, and I guess there was some logic to that, right? Some intended advantages.
Absolutely, at least in theory. The thinking was, if you know exactly what the system needs to do before you start designing,
You can design the whole thing more efficiently.
precisely, design the entire system up front. And customer involvement, well, it happened mainly through these formal reviews at the end of each phase, sign-offs.
Ah, okay. Like checking the blueprints before construction starts.
Sort of. And
Okay.
all that documentation, it was meant to be this comprehensive record, a guide for everyone involved. It sounded very organized, very controlled.
But, and there's always a but, isn't there?
Always. Here's where the real world often threw a wrench in the works.
Okay, what was the big one?
The first major challenge was needing those crystal clear, totally consistent, and 100% correct requirements right from the very start.
That sounds hard.
It's incredibly difficult, let's be honest. Pinning down exactly what a complex piece of software needs to do, getting everyone to agree before you've even started building anything.
It's like trying to perfectly describe a dream you had last week.
Exactly. And if those initial requirements were even slightly off or maybe incomplete or just misinterpreted,
The whole project could be heading in the wrong direction from day one.
right. And because it was so sequential, if one phase got delayed, say, figuring out requirements took way longer than planned.
Everything else down the line got pushed back too.
Yeah, a classic chain reaction. Delays just rippled through the whole project.
Yeah, what about all that documentation you mentioned?
Well, that emphasis often led to creating these huge mountains of paperwork, just
Yeah.
binders and binders full.
But was it useful?
Often.
Yeah.
Not as useful as intended. Sometimes it felt like writing documentation became the goal, rather than building the software.
Right. And how did you even know if you were making progress early on?
That was another tricky part. Often, progress in the early stages was measured by, well, whether the requirements document was finished or if the design document was approved.
Not by actual working software.
Exactly, not by, hey, look, this part of the system actually does something now. It was more like saying you're halfway to your destination just because you've unfolded the map perfectly.
That's a really good way to put it. So documentation milestones, not functional milestones.
Pretty much, in those initial
Oh.
phases. And then think about integration, getting all the different pieces built by different people or teams to actually work together.
That happened right at the end.
Yeah, the Big Bang integration. And the bulk of the testing also happened very late in the cycle.
Uh-oh. I sense danger.
You sense correctly. There is a huge risk of discovering major fundamental problems really late in the game.
When they're way harder and more expensive to fix.
Exactly. Imagine building that whole skyscraper and only then finding out the plumbing system is completely flawed.
Ouch. Okay. And what about the customer? The person getting for
Well,
this?
think about it from their perspective. They wouldn't get to see any actual working features of the system until very, very late in the process. Maybe not until that final testing phase or even deployment.
It's like commissioning a portrait and not seeing even a rough sketch until the artist says, ta-da, here it is.
Perfect analogy. You just had to trust the process and the documents.
And change. What if the customer realized they needed something different halfway through? Or the market shifted?
That was perhaps one of the biggest limitations, especially as the business world got faster. Waterfall was inherently resistant to change.
How so?
Once a phase was officially done and signed off, like the requirements phase, going back to alter those requirements was often a really difficult, bureaucratic, and painful process.
It wasn't designed for flexibility.
Not at all. It was designed to follow the plan rigorously. It's like trying to reroute a river after it's already carved its path deep into the ground. Very hard.
So even with those formal reviews, the customer wasn't really involved day to day.
Generally, no. Genuine, ongoing customer involvement throughout the process was often quite limited. It could feel like the development team took the requirements, vanished into a cave for months.
And then emerged with the finished product, hoping it was right.
Pretty much. So you add all these things up, the difficulty of perfect upfront requirements, the delays, the documentation burden, late integration and testing, lack of visibility, resistance to change.
It really paints a picture of why something had to give.
It really does. These disadvantages created a clear need, a sort of pressure for a different way of doing things.
And that need paved the way for Agile.
Exactly. Now, it's really important for you to understand that Agile isn't like Waterfall. It's not a single rigid methodology.
Okay, what is it then?
It's more of a philosophy, a mindset, a paradigm for software development. It's this broader umbrella term.
And different specific methods fit underneath it.
Precisely. The lecture we're drawing from mentions a few that sort of emerged over time, showing this wasn't one sudden invention, like RAD, Rapid Application Development, back in 91,
Yeah.
UP, or Unified Process, in 94, and then the ones people might be more familiar with today, like Scrum in 95, and XP, or Extreme Programming, in 96.
So it was a movement, really, a gradual shift in thinking.
Absolutely. And the core central idea behind all these Agile approaches is fundamentally different from Waterfall.
How so?
It's about breaking down the system you're building into smaller, manageable pieces, often called product increments or sometimes subsystems.
Like mini projects within the main project.
Sort of. Think of them as functional, working chunks of the final software. And these chunks are delivered in short, fixed-length cycles, time-boxed iterations.
Which are called sprints, right? I've heard that term.
Exactly. Sprints is the common term, especially in Scrum. These are maybe a few weeks long, typically. And the goal is to have something working and potentially shippable at the end of each sprint.
So frequent delivery of working software. That's a key difference
A
already.
huge difference. Early and frequent delivery.
And there's the Agile Manifesto, too. That sounds important.
Very important. It kind of crystallized the core values in 2001. It has 4 main points, framing things as valuing one thing over another.
Okay, like what?
First, individuals and interactions over processes and tools.
So people talking to each other is more important than rigid procedures or specific software.
That's the essence, yeah. Emphasis on communication and collaboration. Second, working software over comprehensive documentation.
Directly tackling that waterfall documentation issue we talked about. The proof is in the pudding, basically.
Exactly. The main measure of progress is software that actually works. Third, customer collaboration over contract negotiation.
So working with the customer continuously,
Yeah.
rather than just sticking rigidly to an initial contract.
Right. It emphasizes partnership throughout the project. And finally, responding to change over following a plan.
That's the big one, isn't it? Directly addressing Waterfall's rigidity.
Absolutely. It acknowledges that change is inevitable, even welcome, and the process should embrace it.
So those are the values. How do they translate into practice? Like day-to-day principles?
Well, these values lead to several key principles. For instance, the highest priority is customer satisfaction through early and continuous delivery of valuable software.
Early and continuous. That tackles the waterfall problem of waiting ages to see anything, right?
Head on! Get valuable stuff to the customer quickly and keep doing it. Another principle, welcome changing requirements, even late in development.
Wow. That's a complete 180 from Waterfall.
Total opposite. Agile sees change as an opportunity, not a problem. It's about harnessing change for the customer's competitive advantage. It's like saying, okay, you realize you need another window halfway up the skyscraper? Cool, let's figure out the best way to add it in the next phase.
Much more adaptable. What else?
Deliver working software frequently, from a couple of weeks to a couple of months, with a preference to the shorter timescale.
Again, shorter cycles, faster feedback, less risk of going way off track.
Precisely. And then there's business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project.
Breaking down those silos. No more throwing requirements over the wall.
Exactly. Constant communication, shared understanding. And related to that, Agile values face-to-face conversation as the most efficient and effective method of conveying information.
So, ideally, teams could be co-located, talking directly.
That's often seen as ideal, yes. It minimizes misunderstandings compared to just relying on emails or documents. It's about high bandwidth communication.
Makes sense. And how do you measure progress?
The primary measure is working software. Simple as that. Not documents signed off, not phases completed on a chart, but actual functionality that you can see and potentially use.
It's really striking when you lay it out like that. You see a problem with Waterfall.
And there's an Agile principle that seems designed specifically to address it.
Yeah, the late visibility. Agile gives early delivery. The rigidity. Agile welcomes change. The documentation focus. Agile values working software. The silos. Agile demands collaboration.
It really clicks, doesn't it? You can see why the shift happened. It wasn't just a fad. It was a response to real, practical problems encountered when trying to build complex things in a waterfall way. A fundamental change in thinking.
Okay, so that explains the why. Now, you mentioned requirements earlier. How does requirements engineering, or RE, fit into this? What even is RE, fundamentally?
Well, at its heart, RE is simply the process of discovering what's actually desired, what's needed in a system, what should it do. And there's a great insight from Goss and Weinberg back in '89.
What's that?
They argued that the process of discovery, the talking, the exploring, the back and forth with stakeholders, is often more important than the final product, the specification document itself.
Because the understanding comes from the conversation.
Exactly. Understanding what people truly need is messy, it's human, it's not just about ticking boxes on a form. Stakeholder involvement is absolutely critical.
So how does the approach to RE differ between Waterfall and Agile?
It's a big difference. In Waterfall, as we said, it's heavily front-loaded. You try to do this massive, comprehensive requirements gathering effort right at the start. Define everything before you move on.
Plan the work, then work the plan.
Pretty much, whereas Agile takes a much more iterative, cyclical approach to requirements.
They're not all defined up front.
No. Requirements are still crucial, obviously, but they're expected to evolve. You revisit and refine them between each sprint. It's a continuous cycle.
What does that cycle look like?
Typically, you'd evaluate the current version of the software after a sprint. Based on that feedback and current priorities, you'd sort of freeze the requirements for the next short sprint. You focus on delivering those. But in parallel, you're always doing ongoing requirements, discovery, refinement, and reprioritization for future sprints.
So it's much more dynamic, learning and adapting as you go.
Much more adaptive, yes.
And you mentioned user stories earlier as a way to capture these requirements in Agile.
Yeah, that's a very common technique for expressing functional requirements, what the system should do for the user. They're intentionally simple.
What's the format?
The lecture gives a standard template. As a type of user, I want some goal or desire. Sometimes you add a so that reason or benefit.
Okay. Can you give an example?
Sure, from the lecture. As an educator, I want to efficiently create and manage exams. Simple, right? Or maybe as an educator, I want to quickly assemble test recipes by selecting questions from a centralized bank.
I see. Focus on the user and their goal.
Exactly. Another one. As an educator, I want the ability to clone previous exams to use as templates.
So that I can reduce repetitive setup tasks, adding the why.
Precisely. Or, as an educator, I want to import questions from external sources so that I can expand the diversity of exam content.
So these are like little prompts for features. Are they just that one sentence?
Oh, good question. No, the text is just the starting point. A user story is generally understood to have three components, often called the 3 C's. Card, conversation, confirmation.
Card, conversation, confirmation. Okay, break that down.
The card is the short written description, like the examples we just gave, often literally written on an index card or a virtual equivalent. It's a token, a placeholder for the requirement.
Okay. Conversation.
That's the crucial part. It represents all the discussions that happen between the developers, the business stakeholders, the users, whoever needs to be involved to clarify the details of that story. What does efficiently manage exams really mean in practice?
So the story is an invitation to talk.
Exactly. It's not the full specification. And the confirmation part refers to the acceptance criteria.
Acceptance criteria.
Yeah, these define how you'll know when the story is actually finished, when it's done. They specify the conditions that must be met. Often they're formulated as specific tests. When I do X, Y should happen.
Got it. So the story, the talking about it, and how we know it's done.
That's the idea.
How do these differ from use cases? I've heard that term too.
They're related. Both describe user interaction. But use case is maybe a more general term, sometimes used in Waterfall too, and can describe a larger scenario. Think of a use case like manage exam questions.
Okay, broader.
Whereas user stories are very much an agile concept. They tend to be smaller, more granular, fitting within a single sprint. Like stories within that manage exam questions use case might be create a multiple choice question, edit an existing question, delete a question. And user stories are explicitly meant to be refined over time through those conversations.
Right, less fixed up front.
No.
Now, how do you know if a user story is actually, well, a good user story?
There's a handy acronym for that. INVEST. It's a checklist to evaluate the quality of user story.
Invest. Okay, what does that stand for?
Independent, N negotiable, V valuable, E estimable, S small, T testable.
Okay, let's quickly unpack those.
Yeah.
Independent.
Ideally, a story should be self-contained. You should be able to implement and deliver it without being heavily dependent on another story. For example, sending an email notification about an exam schedule should ideally be independent of the feature that publishes the schedule. You might want one without the other, or implement them at different times.
Makes sense. Negotiable.
The story isn't a rigid contract. The details should be open for discussion and refinement between the customer and the developers. So a broad need like notify students about exams is negotiable.
You're specifying must use push notifications with this exact sound effect is not very negotiable.
Exactly. It leaves room for finding the best solution collaboratively. Valuable.
This seems obvious, but
It means the story must deliver actual value to the user or the customer. Something like download exam results as a PDF is clearly valuable to a student.
whereas something like refactor the database schema for performance,
While potentially necessary for the system's health, doesn't provide direct, visible value to the end user. Those kinds of technical tasks might be handled differently, not always as user stories.
got it, estimable.
The development team needs to be able to get a rough sense of how much effort this story will take to implement. A story like create multiple choice questions with 4 options is probably estimable.
But something like support all conceivable question types.
Way too broad. You can't really estimate that accurately. You'd need to break it down.
Okay, small.
This relates to estimable. The story should be small enough to be completed within a single sprint. Allow an educator to flag a question for review. That's probably small.
Versus implement the entire exam creation, management, grading, and publishing system.
Exactly. That's an epic, not a story. It needs breaking down into many smaller, manageable stories.
And finally,
Testable. There must be clear criteria to verify whether the story is actually done and working correctly. It needs to be possible to test it. Auto-save the exam draft every 30 seconds. That's clearly testable.
but something vague, like provide a smooth and intuitive user experience.
Much harder to define objective tests for. You need to break that down into more concrete, testable aspects. The lecture even gave interesting edge cases, like you might be able to estimate the effort to support, say, 500 concurrent users.
But actually, testing that under realistic load can be really complex.
Mm-hmm.
So estimable, but maybe not easily testable.
Right. Or conversely, you could easily test if exam submissions load quickly by timing it.
But estimating the development effort to achieve that quickly beforehand might be really hard, depending on the system.
So testable, but maybe not easily estimable. The INVEST criteria are guidelines helping you craft effective requirements for an agile flow.
It's a really practical checklist, and definitely a world away from those massive upfront waterfall requirement documents.
Absolutely, a very different approach driven by those core agile values.
Now, just before we wrap up, a quick look ahead. The lecture materials indicated the next topic is quality requirements.
That's right. Also known as non-functional requirements. Things like performance, security, usability, reliability, the Delorities.
Okay, so how well the system performs its functions, not just what functions it performs. We'll have to dive into that in a future session.
Definitely something to explore.
So just to recap for everyone listening, the big takeaway today is really understanding that move from the very structured, sequential, but often inflexible waterfall model.
To the much more adaptive, iterative, and customer-focused Agile philosophy.
And this shift wasn't arbitrary. It was driven by real-world problems. The near impossibility of getting perfect requirements up front, the pain of delays, the need for faster delivery, and crucially, the need to handle change.
Exactly. Agile, with its focus on working software, collaboration, short cycles, and techniques like user stories guided by Unbest, offers a way to navigate the inherent uncertainty in software development much more effectively.
All right, here's a final thought for you to chew on. We've talked about how software development shifted towards flexibility and continuous feedback with Agile. How might those core principles apply elsewhere in your life or work?
Interesting question.
Think about projects or goals you have where the initial plan rarely survives contact with reality. Where do unexpected things always pop up? What's the equivalent of delivering working software? Those small, valuable, incremental steps in those contexts.
Yeah, how could breaking things down, getting feedback early, and being ready to adapt benefit other kinds of work, or even personal projects?
Definitely some food for thought there.
Yeah.
If this deep dive into Waterfall and Agile has caught your interest, there are tons of great resources out there to learn more about specific Agile methods like Scrum or Kanban.
Absolutely. It's a rich topic. Thinking about how you can apply that mindset of small steps, frequent check-ins, and adaptability, it can be surprisingly powerful well beyond just code.